Apparently, fish farming is a very controversial topic. And today we are very lucky to have Stewart Lamont, who is the managing director of Tangier Lobster Company, come and talk to us. Stewart is a graduate of Dell with a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Law, and a Master's of Public Administration. He's a founding board member of the Lobster Council of Canada and the Nova Scotia Seafood Alliance. He's a board member of the Healthy Bays Network and the Association for the Protection of the Eastern Shore, and is a passionate speaker about lobsters and the health of our oceans. As somebody who is the director of a lobster company, Stewart has a very vested interest in keeping our oceans clean. And today we're here to hear his opinion on this topic. Thank you. I'm surprised you have the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much, Barb. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Stewart Lamont. I'm the managing director of Tangier Lobster Company. I have been in the lobster sector for 44 years and counting. I first started in the industry in 1981. And I have to tell you that I've enjoyed every minute of it. When it was wonderful, when it was horrible, when we had higher prices than I dreamed possible, when we had less market than I thought possible during COVID, when we had geopolitical events, as we do right now, everyone's aware of tariffs, maybe not upcoming. Through it all, I've enjoyed the lobster sector over the last 44 years, and I'm extremely pleased to be here today. Full disclosure, before being invited to present to you today, I knew absolutely nothing about the Seniors College Association of Nova Scotia. Shame on me. But at least I'm candid enough to admit it to you. I'll also tell you I'm the elder son of two school teachers. My father was superintendent of schools from 1960 to 1984 in Yarmouth. My mother was a elementary school teacher in Dartmouth and taught children with special needs in Yarmouth. With any luck, my 96-year-old mother is watching this presentation today. She's a tough marker. I'm aiming to do a reasonable job and get a B+ at least. Also, full disclosure, as much as I'm committed to lifelong learning, my weakness, my incredible weakness, is in the technology and computer area. I'm a danger to myself and others. Our sales director likes to say that her 11-year-old son, Sebastian, has more aptitude and a better attitude than I do. I want to join your organization today, but if I'm going to, either Bill Lee or 11-year-old Sebastian are going to have to help me apply. So with no further ado, let's proceed. My topic today is when governments promote fish farms, who speaks for lobster? It's a provocative, contentious title, and it's meant to be, because I think we in Nova Scotia, and more specifically all of Atlantic Canada, have not made the progress on this file over the last 10 years that the rest of the world has made. In my view, we're still stuck in Nova Scotia in 1958. And when it comes to the promotion and encouragement of open net pen fish farms, 1958 is not a good place to be. So as part of my presentation today, I'd like to give you a little bit of personal background of myself, and more particularly of our company, so you see the perspective that I have on this issue. I like to talk about the importance of lobster to the provincial economy. And I'd like to talk and outline some of the risks that I believe exist when we're promoting open net pen fish farms in this region. In the end, I hope I will have begun to make a reasonably compelling argument that when you ask the question, who speaks for lobster? I certainly do, and I'm hoping that many others will as well. I'm a chap who was born in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, schooled in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, came to Dalhousie to do 3 degrees, as Barb graciously outlined. You might think that my residence in Yarmouth from 1960 to 1972 had something to do with my interest in lobster, because Yarmouth, as many people will know, is sort of the center of the seafood world in Nova Scotia, Yarmouth County, Shelburne County. I'll get in a lot of trouble with my friends in Shelburne County for saying Yarmouth was the center of the seafood world. Let's strike that from the record, if we may. My experience living in Yarmouth was not the key feature that brought me to the lobster sector, actually far from it. As a kid, my memories are going to Amos Brannan's lobster facility at Cape Forshue, just outside of Yarmouth, because lobster for our family was celebration food. If there was a birthday, an anniversary, if someone was visiting from the United States or Ontario, any special occasion whatsoever, my father would make it his business to purchase lobster, and we would have lobster as a family, particularly Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. I remember that. I also remember when we moved first to Yarmouth, there was a very famous restaurant in the community called Harris's Seafood. Some in this audience may be familiar with Harris's, some may have heard about it. Some in the live stream may be aware of it. Harris's had a provincial, a national, and arguably an international reputation back in the day, and it was a big deal when we as a family went there on the first Saturday evening to have a family dinner. And on their menu, among many other items, largely seafood, were 2 items of lobster, lobster sauté and lobster Nova Scotia style. And we sat down as a family and we made our selections, and my father ordered the lobster sauté. And the server came back a few minutes later to see how it was going, and he said, very well indeed, and we were all happy as a family. And then the server came back to see if we still had room for dessert. And everyone pretty much indicated yes, they did. And the server came to my father, and he said, well, he'd like to try the lobster Nova Scotia style for dessert. I think about that, and my mother and I talk about that little exchange frequently. I'd love to know if the Yarmouth School Board ever found that their newly hired superintendent came to the community and had lobster for the main course and lobster for the dessert. And what they thought of it. Did they think then that they had made a fine choice in their selection, or did they think, my God, what have we done? That's a question we'll never be able to answer, unfortunately. But those are my lobster memories from the lobster heart of Nova Scotia, that's for sure. In 1972, I came to Dal and started my degrees programs. And I was something of a permanent student. I started with an arts program and then went to law school because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I did a master's in public administration because I still didn't know what I wanted to do. What I really wanted to do was become a writer. And I was fulfilling the various educational components until inevitably I thought I was going to be discovered. I always was impressed by that story of Lana Turner at the soda fountain in 1936. She was discovered there and was in Hollywood the next day. I was a writer who thought I was going to be discovered, and I would have a column in the New York Times. Well, I'm here to tell you that never happened. I applied to go to Columbia, though, University in New York, because I wanted a degree in journalism. I thought that was the key to my writing career. And I had a friend whose wife at the time was an associate editor at Maclean's magazine. And she said, you have enough background now that if you can write, you should pursue a career. Apply to a newspaper, apply to a magazine, do freelance work, just get out there and write if you can write. Famously, she then followed that up with, if you can't write, 17 degrees aren't going to help you, Stewart. I never forgot that, and I always wondered, could I write or not? That summer, my life changed, which I know this is a long roundabout story, but I'm getting there. That summer changed. My cousin approached me to manage his restaurant on the Eastern Shore for the summer because he had a burgeoning lobster business, and he saw much more potential in live lobster export than the restaurant trade. So he wanted me to be responsible for the restaurant while he worked on the exciting side on live lobster export. To his credit, he wanted me to come to the lobster facility at night after the restaurant closed and to listen to him negotiating with his clients in Toronto and Vancouver. So that's what happened. I spent the summer there. Still wondering if I should go to Columbia, still wondering if 17 degrees would help me if I wanted to be a writer. And I would go and listen to the conversations in selling lobster. And for those who are not familiar, we sell live lobster in increments of quarter-pound intervals. So we export 1 pound lobsters, 1.25 pound lobsters, 1.5 pound, right up to 6 to 9 pound lobsters. So I would listen to my cousin negotiating. This is long before the fax machine, long before the internet. Big companies had telex machines, but we never had one of those. So they were verbal discussions on the telephone at night, frequently with Asian purchasers in Toronto and my cousin in Tangier. I wish I had them on tape. They were remarkable. And all the deals that got done in those days were verbal contracts. He would specify what was available. They would specify what they wanted. They would discuss the pricing and the freight charge by air freight to get to Toronto. And a deal would get done. Now, we couldn't possibly do that today. Today, we have more formalized contracts. We have purchase orders. We have pro forma invoices. We have companies pre-approved for credit. We have companies guaranteed for insurance by the Export Development Corporation. I mean, it is so different today than it was in 1981. But there was a certain romance to the business in 1981, and my cousin was exceptionally talented at it. I lingered in his office for the balance of that summer. I decided not to go to New York. He offered me a year's salary, and I would only have to work 6 months. That sounded pretty good. Then I discovered we were going to do 2 years' work in the actual 6 months. he said I could do what I really wanted to do, which is travel and write, which I did. I didn't know that the travel would be associated with promotion of the business rather than me going to Barbados. But I wrote extensively. I became more and more intrigued, interested, fascinated by the potential of Nova Scotia lobster exported around the world. We were developing a facility. When I first started, we could hold 14,000 pounds of live lobster. Today, we can hold something in excess of 500,000 pounds. At that time, the facility was not refrigerated, so we were obliged to monitor our inventory relative to ocean water temperatures, and you knew at certain temperatures you shouldn't have much inventory. Applied lobster science was in its early days, so we as a company and the industry as a whole didn't know what we know today. Air freight of live lobster was absolutely in its infancy. The Halifax airport had limited facilities. The airport runway was only a fraction of what it is today. The gateway facility that exists today, which is equal to anything on the eastern seaboard and better than anything in Boston or New York, didn't exist in those days. So it was the early days of live lobster, and in effect, that comment, the world is your oyster, applied. We could literally look anywhere on the map and decide, well, might this be an interesting place to export our products? The first place I looked was the United States of America. We had done as a family, and I had done personally, a lot of travel in America. I knew the appetite for seafood on the West Coast, San Francisco, Los Angeles in particular. I knew something about the appetite for specialty foods in Las Vegas. I certainly was aware of the focus on seafood in New England and going down to New York and further down Atlanta and Florida. So my first undertaking was to look at ways we could air freight to various places in the United States of America, and could we find clients that were honorable, reputable, creditworthy, and would be interested in product from a small company in Tangier, Nova Scotia. It turned out we could. It turned out that many lobster buyers in America didn't understand the distinguishing features between Canadian lobster and New England lobster. New England lobster tends to have far less shelf life. It tends to be far less well meated. It tends to be smaller in size other than the offshore catch. So it's a very different product overall. We would have chef sessions with chefs in Las Vegas to cook a Maine lobster and to cook a Nova Scotia lobster and compare the meat yield side by side. We did all those sorts of things. I went 17 or 18 years to the Boston Seafood Show, meeting with clients from all over America and all over the world. After 18 years, I was talked out. I know that may be hard to believe, but I decided we had to do other things. Beyond selling lobster in America, we sell lobster and have for 25, 30 years in Europe. We sell lobster in Asia. We sell lobster in the Middle East. We have a shipment going to Dubai tomorrow morning. We shipped a major shipment to South Korea today. We are negotiating and finalizing large shipments for Guangzhou, China, and Shanghai, China, Thursday departure. So the world is literally our oyster. I'm a huge proponent of the benefits of export to the Nova Scotia economy. It's also been an education. We have learned as we've developed relationships with our client in Belgium, we learn much, much more about Belgian culture. As we develop relationships in South Korea and China and elsewhere, it's an educational experience. I like to say we're in the relationship business. Lobster just happens to be our product. So I am passionate about it. We try to locate and identify the very best in quality in live lobster anywhere in Atlantic Canada at all times. Fortunately, and I'm not being a homer when I say this, the lobster on the Atlantic side of Nova Scotia is considered, in effect, the best in Atlantic Canada. It's a product that has a blacker coloration. It is a product that the meat yield is greater than lobster from other jurisdictions. And it is a product which has high blood protein, which is the single easiest way we identify what is a premium quality lobster. We go out of our way for clients that are committed to us and willing to support us. We go out of our way to have 12 months of the year supply for them to ensure that what they really need and the best air freight options around the world are available to them. In recent years, tremendous improvements have been made in air freight logistics from Atlantic Canada. Halifax, Stanfield International Airport, from a perishables handling standpoint, is second to none. We have a Korean charter that comes into this community 3 times a week. So it provides a direct charter flight from Halifax to Incheon, which is Seoul, Korea, and then on elsewhere in Asia. So we've come as an industry and we've come as a province a very long way in this industry over the last 40 plus years. Why am I passionate about lobster? First of all, it's the iconic crustacean for Atlantic Canada. So iconic crustacean for Nova Scotia. Many people, when they think of this region, think of our seafood. And when they think of our seafood, they think first and foremost about our lobster. Again, it's celebration food. It's a terrific product. We harvest in Atlantic Canada in excess of 200 million pounds of lobster on an annual basis. Every year is a slight variation depending on the biomass and depending on the weather. But 200 million plus pounds of lobster is harvested in this region. About 50%, give or take, is harvested right here in Nova Scotia. It is a $3 billion sector for the region. And I can tell you, and many of you can tell me, that we don't have a lot of $3 billion sectors in this part of the country. I say all of this because I'm passionate about it, but I say all of this because I don't want anything to jeopardize the success and the sustainability of lobster in this province. On top of the pure numbers, there's also the community feel that lobster represents. If I talk to someone from Isle Madame in Cape Breton, they will say our lobsters are the absolute best, Stewart. And then you talk to somebody in Pictou County, well, our lobsters are the best. And then you talk to somebody in Wedgeport in southwest Nova Scotia and surprise, surprise, their lobsters are the best. I have never met anyone in Atlantic Canada who lived anywhere who couldn't say his or her lobster we're the absolute best anywhere. What's the reason for that? First of all, most lobsters are an excellent dining experience for those who admire the product. But because it's associated with positive experiences, the taste of the lobster seems to be a little better. So if you're celebrating someone who just got a promotion, well, guess what? The lobsters taste better. If you're celebrating someone visiting from Lethbridge or Thunder Bay or wherever, the lobsters taste better. So I'm convinced there's a psychological aspect, and I'm convinced it's significant. It doesn't apply to all products. I never heard anybody say, well, our turnips in Pictou County were the best. But I've heard everybody talk about lobster. So we declare they're the best, and we have a favorable experience, and that's all good. We carefully identify our resource when we're buying it. We need to know what the shelf life of that lobster is. We need to know what the meat yield of that lobster would be. We need to know all of these things as best we can so that we can properly represent the product to our clients who are expecting the best of the best. So we have 40 lobster fishing areas. They're known as LFAs in Atlantic Canada. They rotate to a large degree by virtue of geography and season. Just like in a baseball diamond, it's wisdom after the fact that from first to second base is 90 feet and from second to third is 90 feet. The distribution of the seasons and the time when fishermen are allowed to fish means that in general, we have lobster available to some degree, not 12 months of the year, but a good chunk of that time. And we don't overfish the resource in a given area. So in my home area on the Eastern Shore, we have a 9-week season only. 9 weeks out of 52 in which fishermen can go fishing. And that ensures that the biomass will be protected and insured for the long term. So the regulation of the seasons has been vital. We have trap limits. We have minimum size limits that are legal. We have female spawn lobsters must be put back in the ocean by the fishermen. We don't have a perfect record in terms of compliance in the lobster sector. I would never pretend that. But I will tell you it's been a well-managed fishery to the credit of both levels of government, to the credit of commercial harvesters, the shore buyers, the live lobster exporters, and the processors. It is a sector which has stood the test of time rather well. Our company exports about $30 million of $30 million sales in lobster on an annual basis, give or take. Lobster this particular season that began on the 1st of December in Southwest Nova Scotia, Mother Nature didn't get the memo. Mother Nature this December and January has given us a somewhat disappointing lobster. If you think of lobster as I do as a vintage, we talk about a particular vintage of wine in a given year being favorable and a lesser vintage another year. This year from December to this moment has been a rather disappointing vintage. It is a lesser shell quality lobster. It is not as fully meated, unfortunately. And we just have to work through that as best we can until about the middle of March, when Mother Nature will turn on the switch, and all of a sudden we'll have a superb lobster once again. My cousin, who was my mentor, used to say when the crocuses come up, the lobster will be excellent quality. So No one's standing here waiting for crocuses any more than I am right now. All of this brings me in a roundabout sort of way to fish farms. Where to begin when it comes to open net pen fish farms? Maybe here. How did the industry have the audacity to call themselves farmers? Where did they figure that they were part of the farming community? I think all of us in this room know farmers. Farmers are salt of the earth. Farmers have a sustainable and honorable business model. They grow healthy food. The operators of so-called fish farms, which are more accurately known as feedlots, might be a lot of things, but they are not farmers. So for us as a community, for us as a government to allow the growers of open net pen fish farms to call themselves farmers is, in my view, a scandal, but we can't delve too far into that today. My first exposure to the industry was in 1996. It was the end of July. It was on a Friday afternoon, about 2 o'clock. Our company and 3 other companies had about 200,000 pounds of live lobster in a tidal pound in Back Bay, New Brunswick. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the notion of a tidal pound. It was a place where companies would store lobster that they bought in the season until the lobster season was over. There was no new lobster coming in from the fishery, and you could take the lobster out of your tidal pound to keep your clients going in supply here in Canada and around the world. It was a very popular business model before individually segregated lobster units were developed. We call them in some circumstances lobster condos. You have an on-land facility that rotates water. You refrigerate that water to somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius. The lobsters are basically in hibernation, but they're in individual units because lobsters left open to each other will cannibalize. Lobsters will consume each other and they will choose their compatriots which are weakest. So we must segregate lobsters from one another. We keep them in super chilled 2 to 4 degree water, so they're basically in hibernation. They derive nutrition from the salt water. We make sure that there is 90 to 95% dissolved oxygen in that water, so they're very healthy. I think of these on-land facilities as a hospital because all the needs of the lobster are attended to. So that is the comparison. But in 1996, when I got this call on a Friday afternoon, when we had lobsters with 3 other companies and 200,000 pounds in the facility in Back Bay, New Brunswick, the call I got was, "Stewart, all your lobsters are dead." That wasn't the call I expected. It wasn't the call I wanted. We quickly discovered the source of the problem. There were open net pen salmon farmers across the bay. They had had a problem with lice on the salmon. When salmon are congested in pens, particularly in warm water, they tend to contract lice. And the most effective way to deal with that lice is to apply pesticides to remove the lice from the salmon. I dare say we all have consumed, if we've consumed open net pen salmon at some stage of our career, and me included, we have had consumed salmon that had a lice problem for which pesticides were treated. You're not told that at the supermarket, that's for sure. So we got this call at 2:00 in the afternoon on a Friday. The 4 companies rounded up our trucks and our employees, and we drove to Back Bay, New Brunswick, which is about a 6-7 hour run from Halifax. And we arrived there, and here were thousands and thousands of lobster dead on the side of the natural pound. It was overwhelming. I can remember it as if it were yesterday. The cypermethrin, which was the pesticide that the farmers used, is illegal in Canada, but it was legal at the time in America, had been smuggled in. They had treated their salmon with the cypermethrin. Traces of the cypermethrin came over with the current to the natural pound, and it killed all the lobster. Now, I'm exaggerating. Believe it or not, the lobsters that our company had in the facility were overwhelmingly saved. We were, just by happenstance, we were in the part of the natural pound at the high water level. And the cypermethrin didn't reach that in the proportion that it reached other parts of the lobster facility. But to make a long story short, there was massive, massive mortality. We engaged the leading law firm in New Brunswick at the time. We engaged the leading litigator in the leading law firm at the time. He began to do an investigation. About a month later, he had secured an acknowledgement from the local salmon farming group. They weren't individually acknowledging fault, but they collectively acknowledged fault. We got a 6-figure out of court settlement. It covered 90% of the value of our lobster in the facility. It was going to be, ironically, one of those years in which the market was short of product. So we had a lot of profit in that natural pound. But under the circumstances, we were darn happy to get 90% of the group's investment back. That incident leaves a mark on you, makes you aware of the nature of the business model, particularly applying pesticides to a food product. There wasn't the regulation of farmers, so-called farmers, in those days that there should have been. I argue that it's only marginally better today. There's no question there is more stringent regulation of open net pen fish farms in Atlantic Canada and in Nova Scotia. But is it anywhere close to what it could be and should be? I would suggest no. And I would say you do not hear a single good thing about the development of fin fish aquaculture coming from a salmon pen. Now, very briefly, so that we don't confuse the issue, I'm technically challenged, but I confess that already. Let's not do that. Pointer's just going to get me in trouble. There are 3 types of aquaculture, and it's important to recognize the difference among the 3. Shellfish aquaculture is essentially the growing of oysters and mussels. As long as it's done to scale, in other words, not overwhelming massive projects, it's widely considered to be a good form of aquaculture, favorable to the economy of Nova Scotia and elsewhere in Atlantic Canada, and far from being opposed to it, I support it and would like to see the rules associated with development of reasonable scale shellfish farms. I'd like to see those made somewhat easier. The government of Nova Scotia, to its credit, is going to introduce legislation which to some degree streamlines these activities. But there are many in the industry who tell me that the burden for a small entrepreneur, for a small company to develop an oyster or a mussel operation, those burdens are extreme, and we could do much better relative to the risk that they represent. There is not the pollution or the treatment by pesticides or various other aspects of the business model when it comes to shellfish aquaculture. So I put it in the good column. On-land closed containment, I briefly talked about. You remove net pens out of the ocean. You do not have the escapes that we currently have from net pens out in the water for one reason or another after a storm. It's very common for salmon to escape, feedlot salmon to escape into the wild. When you are growing finfish on land, you can monitor the temperature, the oxygen, the salinity. You can monitor all those features perfectly. You just have to pay a utility bill. That's what the big players who shall go unmentioned, unnamed today, that's what they don't want to do. They don't want to pay a utility bill. Once they have an approval for a net pen operation, the so-called, what the economists call the externalities. The externalities are picked up by you folks. They're picked up by the taxpayer. If there's pollution in the coastal waters, ultimately that's the problem of the jurisdiction. If the company shuts down a farm and goes elsewhere and doesn't do the proper cleanup, there's very little likelihood that the company will do that cleanup. The province of Nova Scotia may well have to. All of the externalities, the utility bill for 500,000 pounds of live lobster, it costs us $25,000 a month for the utility bill associated with maintaining sufficient cold water and pumps and refrigeration for that operation. That's a cost of doing business in the lobster sector today. We're in a very different place than we were in 1981 when I started. For the growers of finfish aquaculture, they should be thrilled to pay that utility bill, in my opinion, because it would be taking them out of the socially undesirable product we're involved with list. And secondly, they can command a better price in the market for an on-land closed containment salmon than they can for one that's grown in a feedlot. So the idea that the traditional aquaculture players want no part of on-land closed containment, which is accurate. They really want no part of it. There are two unique companies in this province which grow salmon on land and do so in the proper, following the proper metrics. But generally speaking, the large companies want no part of it because they do not want to pay that power bill. They want all the externalities for free. And for 25, 30 years, the governments of all 4 Atlantic provinces have given it to them. So the third category is the category that's, in my view, unacceptable. I had an industry insider tell me 3 weeks ago that within 10 years, there wouldn't be any net pen operations anywhere in the world. That it's a tired, damaged, tawdry business model. More and more consumers are finding out in sessions like this what it really represents, and that within 10 years, open net pen will be over. I tend to think that may be accurate, but I don't have 10 years more to devote to this topic. I want to talk specifically about 3 concerns that I have with regard to open net pen, because I'm following the clock. I've been given an hour and we're at 45 minutes plus already. There are 3 aspects of this business model that I really can't get over, I really can't accept, and I try to speak and write about them on a regular basis. First, during a normal 16-month growth period in an open net pen fish farm, there can be up to 1,000 metric ton of fecal and food waste released below the net pen. 1,000 metric ton. I'm not good with visuals and comparisons. I'm not good at that at all. So many, many years ago, I asked a friend, what's 1,000 metric ton? What does that represent? And my friend said, well, you're in the live lobster freight business. That's the equivalent of a 747 jumbo jet, very common back in the day. Or it's the equivalent of the waste of a decent sized town of 30 or 40,000 people dumped straight into the ocean. We've progressed beyond that in most communities. We've progressed beyond that in the lobster sector, but we're still clinging to that outmoded technology in open net pen fish farming. And so if any of us were out in a dory and we were on the water and we threw a couple chip bags into the ocean, we could be fined for pollution, and rightly so, in my opinion. Meanwhile, we have a fish farming operation that could release up to 1,000 metric ton of fecal and food waste. And not only do we not condemn it, not only do we not fine them, we encourage them. The government is of the view, absolutely mistakenly, in my humble opinion, that we need more aquaculture generally in this province, but we need more open net pen. It doesn't even remotely add up, in my humble opinion. We need to be able to say that kind of pollution actively taking place in our coastal waters is not acceptable. Secondly, and this takes us back to the risk for the lobster sector, in my view, I have told the last 5 or 6, I've lost count, provincial ministers of fishery and aquaculture that we are just one viral video away from real trouble in the lobster sector. If we had a viral video related to the growing of open net pen salmon in our coastal waters. And if that video showed lobsters grazing below the surface on the waste adjacent to the net pens in Europe, ironically in Europe, which was the original home of fish farms, the game would be over. Europe is 10 years ahead of us in North America in terms of environmental awareness and things you can and cannot do. North America is 10 years ahead of Asia, generally speaking, in terms of environmental awareness and things you can or cannot do. Europe is a canary in the coal mine. And even though, amazingly, Norway was the home of the original fish farms, our business model in live lobster would be over in the same week. Now, I've made that pitch to many ministers, to many senior bureaucrats. I sit on the Minister's Advisory Committee of Aquaculture, and I've said it there. It's gotten no traction. It's not a subject that government wants to hear, because government, rightly or wrongly, historically, federally, although less so recently, and certainly in the provincial level, has been committed to fin fish aquaculture in the ocean for the last 20 years. And this is not, I must emphasize this is not a partisan issue. I have battled originally the Conservatives and then battled the NDP and then battled the Liberals. And I'm now battling the Conservatives again. And I like to portray myself as the least knowledgeable person on this file in our group. I'm a member of the Healthy Bays Network. There are 150, 200 people in Nova Scotia who are dramatically more knowledgeable on this file than I am. I just happen to be a guy who speaks from a lobster perspective. So I sit in fear of that viral video, which, if it ever gets shown around the world, will cost this province and my industry a fortune and maybe its survival. Thirdly, I want to talk just a tiny bit about climate change. All of us in this room are well aware of what the impact of climate change has been. And anyone who lives on the coast is even more aware, because we see changes on a daily basis. The group that are most aware and are on the front lines of climate change, ironically, are commercial fishermen. Harvesters are on the water, and they see in a given community what it was like last week, what it was like 10 years ago, what it was like when they were first on the water. The changes have been dramatic. And the bottom line is we have a greater frequency of storms on the ocean and a more severity of storms on the ocean. And when you have more storms and more severe storms, that's a very serious combination. So just imagine a net pen out in the ocean. Think of Fiona. What it might have been like for the inventory in net pens in the ocean during Fiona. We have our warmest water in August, September, October. And so the fish, being cold-blooded, become more active and more agitated within the pens. We have our coldest water in January, February, and March. So you can have super chill water conditions which expose the fish in a net pen to stresses they are not nearly designed to tolerate. We can't control any of that with this business model. If they were in on-land closed containment facilities, you can keep permanent water temperature at 2 to 4 degrees Celsius whatever you might want for the benefit of this product. So for those three reasons and a dozen more that we could talk about, I remain a fierce opponent of this business model, and I try to talk about it and write about it whenever I can. Now, what do we do if we're concerned and want to take action? What the heck does an individual citizen, an individual consumer actually do? Well, it turns out we can do a lot. It turns out there are various means by which consumers first and citizens second can make a statement. As consumers, we can tell our seafood purveyors, whether it's a grocery chain, whether it's a retail seafood market, we can tell them, look, we don't want open net pen salmon and open net pen trout served in this community. We don't think it's favorable to the community's health. We don't think it's a sustainable business model. We're concerned about the impacts it may have and is having on other wild fisheries. We don't want any part of that activity. I can tell you that retailers and wholesalers of anything, seafood included, respond to community concerns. So if you express your concerns, and particularly if you have a relationship with a local seafood purveyor, say, look, I want to support you. I want to buy seafood. It's brain food. The government can't be eating enough of it, but it's brain food. What else can I have rather than salmon? What else can I have rather than open net pen salmon? Have you investigated on-land closed containment products? Have you looked at other options? What do you have that's healthier for me and my family and my visitors from Thunder Bay? I think we have to do that. A second thing we have to do is demand labeling reforms. I can go to a seafood market and be shown fresh Atlantic salmon. Now, when I hear fresh Atlantic salmon, that sounds to me like a pretty good product, a pretty good deal. It turns out the fresh Atlantic salmon isn't necessarily, and in fact, in Atlantic Canada certainly is not, wild harvested. It's aquaculture grown salmon. And so it may be on land closed containment salmon, or it may be open net pen fish farm salmon, but it's all fresh Atlantic salmon. So I would argue, and I'm hoping you would agree, that with labeling, and labeling is a federal jurisdiction, not provincial, you have to know every level of government when you get on this file. I would argue that it should show farm raised. And if it's grown on land and therefore checks the healthy box, it should show on land raised. And if it's grown out in the ocean in a net pen, it should say net pen raised. There should be some way at the supermarket counter that some individual, or at least a display, would tell you the difference among the various options. Now, I know you didn't sign up for a study in whatever to be able to buy seafood at your seafood counter. I didn't sign up for geopolitics when I got into the lobster business, but that's where we find ourselves today. And I would argue we need to make ourselves much more knowledgeable. Fortunately, we have an option that will help us, and that's a group called Off the Table. You may have heard of it. Off the Table was started in the UK, went to Australia, went to Iceland, is now in Canada. And they are strongly encouraging the restaurant trade and the retail trade in seafood to remove open net pen salmon from their menus. It will be a consumer initiative. It will be successful or not based on an awareness by restaurateurs that this is not an appropriate item on the menu. Now, I'm in the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia, even though I don't own a restaurant. I'm a huge supporter of the restaurants in this province and elsewhere. No one has been hurt by COVID more than the restaurant trade. So it's not that Off the Table wants to come down with a hammer against restaurateurs. It's that they want them to make healthier choices, and we as consumers will then support those restaurants to a greater degree. So it's a positive encouragement in the end to do the right thing and not carry open net pen on their menus. That's the role we can play as consumers. Now let's just talk for a minute of the role we can play as citizens. We just had a provincial election. I personally am ticked about it because I thought we had a fixed election date for July 15th, 2025. And we just had an election, but we can't go there today either. Governments can be influenced. This particular government in Nova Scotia, I can tell you for a fact, listens to its MLAs. The Premier doesn't lack for ideas that things he would like to do, but on those occasions where he's going in the wrong direction, if his MLAs speak up to him, to his credit, he has a track record of changing his direction. I would suggest that as many of us who have an interest in this topic as possibly can, speak to your MLA. Pick up the phone, give them a call, say, where do you stand on open net pen? I'm hearing more and more things that are really troubling. Write an email, sign a petition. There are lots of them from time to time. Do something to make sure your MLA, regardless of the political stripe, make sure your MLA is aware if you have concerns on this topic. Nova Scotia is a comparatively small place. We don't need to raise millions of dollars to affect political change as they do in America. We don't need hundreds of thousands of people to express that concern as they do elsewhere. We need motivated citizens to speak to their MLAs who will go to caucus and on Wednesday morning say, look, Mr. Premier, on this particular issue, I think we have a problem. The combination of our commercial activity as consumers and saying no to net pen, coupled with our citizen responsibility saying this doesn't cut it, can make a difference. Nova Scotia's tagline for my entire life has been Canada's ocean playground. Well, what kind of an ocean playground is it if we're going to contaminate it with open net pen in various bays and nooks and crannies around the province? I mean, it's just unthinkable in my view, but There's greater and greater awareness to the nature of the issue after sessions like today. And I'd like to think that we as individuals can ultimately make a difference in this province. So I thank you for your incredible attention for over an hour. And I appreciate you listening. Thank you very much.
Okay, there's a lady there who'd like to ask a question. You go ahead.
Okay, I wish to share your optimism about opening.
This is for the folks.
Oh, sorry. I wish to share your optimism about open nets being on the decline and that in 10 years they'll be over. What signs do you see that this is actually going to happen?
Thank you for asking. I can tell you a whole lot of signs. The government of Norway increased exponentially taxes in that country for open net pen operations. The industry is crying, we can't possibly afford it, but it's a statement from the home of aquaculture, finfish net pen aquaculture, that this isn't acceptable, and they have to begin to pay for the so-called externalities. The state of Washington last week declared that open net pen business activities would be permanently banned from their coastal waters. They had a very unfortunate incident with a collapse and escape of a Cook aquaculture system a number of years ago. And the government, the state of Washington has said no more. The government of Chile, which used to be the most welcoming country around the world for net pens because they had deep fjords and supposedly the right conditions for net pen aquaculture, has now imposed new rules that are going to restrict this activity considerably. The government of Canada, on their very last legs, maybe, has banned open net pen in British Columbia 4 years from now, as it turns out. So there are signs all around the world, not enough, not quickly enough, not sufficiently convincing for your liking, maybe, or mine, but there are lots of signs that things are changing.
Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Jeff Nickerson. So as you can see by my sweater, I work for Cook Aquaculture.
Hi, Jeff. You and I know each other
We know
well.
each other quite well, and Stewart and I have disagreed on numerous times. We've
Yeah.
agreed on a few things,
Yes.
but I came here today because I've heard a few of these talks that you've given Stewart, and to be frank, a lot of it is not true. Excuse me. You're looking at the industry. You compared the lobster industry years ago in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when you started in the 80s, and how much technology has changed, how much the way you guys have done business has changed. The same is true for our industry. We're a science-based industry. Everything we do is based on science. Yes, in the early 80s, when the industry started in Atlantic Canada, people made mistakes. There were food conversion ratios that were probably higher than they are now. But through determination, we worked to get to where we are today. As far as...
May I respond to that first?
Sure.
We have to respectfully, Jeff, agree to disagree. The lobster sector has never, ever been subject to, 3% of the community criticism that open net pen fish farming is. Open net fish farms are generally, among those who are most knowledgeable, unacceptable. They're not considered beneficial in your backyard. You don't hear any criticism. You don't hear any criticism of the lobster sector that's even remotely comparable to the criticism in your sector. So, I mean, I can't buy that. That's ridiculous.
Hey, I am a supporter of the lobster industry.
I understand that and I appreciate it.
My grandfather went out with his wooden traps and his woolen mittens.
I appreciate it.
I'm not here to.
None of this
debate
is personal,
today. No, it isn't. If I could,
but please don't compare lobster and open net pen.
I didn't compare it. I stated that things have changed in both industries and they've evolved. Looking at technology, I believe is what I said. I don't think I compared them. Exactly. I'm a farmer. You said earlier that we have the audacity to call ourselves farmers.
Yes.
I've been a salmon farmer for 32 years in Nova Scotia. Started out in the Annapolis Basin, the site by the ferry terminal, which is still in operation. When we first started, there was an NGO that came to a meeting and said there will be no lobster fishery left. There will be no tourism industry left. There will be no scallop industry left. There'll be no clam. So 32 years have passed. I'd like to have that same conversation with this person.
Sure.
The lobster industry is thriving. Is it because of aquaculture? No. But I think it proves that we're not hurting it. If you talk with any of the fishermen in Digby, where we've operated for 30 some years, you know, if you've heard that, I'd like to hear who it's from and have a conversation with them. We're not seeing that. What we are seeing is people that are going and spreading false information, taking information, twisting it around and misleading people. That's just not right.
May I respond to that?
Sure.
I try never, ever to twist information or give information that's not correct. I reference Cook's activity in the state of Washington and the decision of last week. I hope you will agree that I haven't taken that out of context. Okay, the lobster stocks over the last 20 years have grown enormously. Most of the prevailing science says the reason for that is not the absence or the presence of fish farming, it's the demise of ground fish. With the demise of cod and other species, more lobsters have reached maturity. What we don't know is how many more lobsters might have reached maturity had those fish farms not be there. Now, you can laugh and you can say that's not of consequence, but for people in coastal communities where they're actively lobster fishing and the catches have gone down, all of this is a concern.
Well, agree to disagree again.
Sure.
Because you have taken things and turned them around and made false accusations, but you're also misleading. You mentioned earlier about sea lice. Sea lice are naturally occurring, especially the ones that go on salmon. When we put our fish in the water, they're certified disease-free. There are no sea lice, there are no diseases. They go in the water, they contract occasionally, not in Nova Scotia, but in other areas, they've contracted sea lice from the wild salmon. And years ago, therapeutics were used. Now, through science, we have determined that the sea lice will die if we give a hot water spray over the salmon, or if fresh water will kill the sea lice as well. So what we have now are vessels that take the fish, we run them through a warm water shower and put them back in the cage. The sea lice that come off of the fish are collected in a filter system and disposed of at a landfill. The other thing that we're doing is our cleaner fish, such as lumpfish, are less favorite dessert with sea lice. So we are putting some of those in the cages and trialing that, and it's working very well. But I don't want to take up a lot of time.
May I respond to that?
Sure.
Are you of the belief that there's adequate supervision of your sector by the regulatory authorities? Do you think that your facilities are inspected sufficiently and rigorously to make sure that what you allege is actually true?
Stewart, you and I were both on the Minister's Advisory Committee.
Yes.
And we disagreed there, and we're going to disagree again.
Yes.
I think that we are very well regulated. I would say that we're probably one of the better regulated industries in the world as far as in Nova Scotia with that.
Here's why I'll suggest you're not. We have a lobster facility. I can't remember when our facility was last inspected by a provincial inspector, okay? Lobster in terms of risk compared to open net pen, I'm hoping we both agree the risk is much less with lobster, but we haven't been inspected at all. When I don't see inspectors at our facility, how confident can I be that you have inspectors regularly watching out for you?
Well, you can be very comfortable with that. We have to
I
have,
think I'm gonna have to
Okay.
stop this, because we have a lot of questions online that we need to ask. I really respect what you're saying. I am glad that we have a couple of different opinions here.
if I could just make one last comment.
Go right ahead.
This group here, obviously, science backgrounds. I would love to come at some opportunity and give you a bit of an update on our industry and give you some facts, not the alternative facts, but some facts that we can back up. So thanks.
Would you give me your contact information?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough.
Sure.
Okay, we have some questions online.
Yes, there are a few questions online about. Patching in. Yep. You here? Yes, there's a question online that asks, so you mentioned a $3 billion industry. How much of this? Yeah. How much of this industry stays in Canada and how much is exported?
Well, it's a good chunk, 75 to 80% of lobster is exported from Canada, but we're talking about the export value, all of which stays in Canada essentially. We have some internationally owned companies, but that's minimal in the scheme of things. So the vast bulk of the $3 billion export value of lobster stays right here in Atlantic Canada. And it stays among commercial harvesters, local shore buyer companies, processors, live lobster exporters, and governments are also beneficiaries of that value.
We have another question here from the floor.
Hi, my name is Pat, and we actually can't hear what's happening in this microphone from up there. So I'm gonna kind of speak sideways so people can hear me. I really appreciated your presentation. I can feel your passion for the lobsters and for the industry, and I didn't realize how incredibly lucrative an industry it is in Canada, in Maritimes especially. My questions are quick and hopefully quickly to answer about being active citizens on this. So you said the Premier listens to his MLAs. Does he listen to opposition MLAs?
I don't.
Stewart, we can can you repeat it?
Yes, the question was, I said earlier that the Premier has been known to change policy direction based on concerns expressed by his MLAs in caucus. And in fairness to the Premier or any other leader, they all tend to listen primarily and overwhelmingly to their own caucus members. So there are various other ways that you could reach out to the government of Nova Scotia if you're concerned about open net pen. But there's no question the primary focus of a provincial leader, Houston or anyone else, will be to his or her own MLAs.
So
They meet in caucus every week and key issues are brought up, and the Premier of this province is well known for listening to his
MLA.
MLAs.
So the regulation that you mentioned is going to be presented in the next legislative session. Is that are those regulations? Is that bill available to look at now, or are we going to have to wait until it's presented and whenever the next session is?
The question was the regulation changes which are coming primarily in shellfish aquaculture. It may be too late. The province would have had comment periods for the public on their website and so forth. I'm not sure that you can comment on that now. These are ways in which the government can and will facilitate for more active shellfish aquaculture in this province. Those regulations are not primarily with regard to open net pen fish farms. There are a variety of developments in the offing, but the biggest single one is a classification system that will be introduced that will say those areas which are most appropriate for open net pen and those which aren't. And I'll be very anxious to see what the classification system reveals. I think based on lack of current and lack of depth of our coastal waters, I think there are very few places in Nova Scotia that will be declared to be appropriate for open net pen.
Okay, one last question. This might be a little harder to answer, and I really don't have any idea of an answer. But the connection, you mentioned about climate change, and the connection to problems that it poses for the fishery, for the lobster fishery, and for other fisheries. Is there any way you can draw any impact that climate change is having on and combine on the fishery, like as climate change, and does that connect to the open pens? Because I'm thinking the heating of the ocean, when you put like fecal material at the bottom of the bay, that's going to be heated up by heating water, by the heating.
Yes,
water.
technically warming water. We have data in our company that our incoming water, and this is a facility in Tangier on the Eastern Shore, our incoming water temperature has increased 4% in the last 6 years. So the average temperature on any given day year round is 4% warmer than it was 6 years ago. I couldn't credit it. I have a young quality control manager who can document it chapter and verse that our water temperature in our area, and maybe Tangier, Nova Scotia is an outlier. Maybe it's an exception. Maybe ocean water isn't warming as much elsewhere, but the impacts of climate change, I would argue, are overwhelming. I'm not sure if the Conservative Party of Canada yet admits that such a thing as climate change exists. 2 or 3 years ago, they said it didn't. But this is an issue, and it's impacting all of the wild fisheries. And I would argue that it has to be impacting aquaculture as well. There will be instances in which climate change conditions are beneficial in a limited way, in a limited fishery, but there will be lots of instances when it is not. Warm water in September and October is a huge challenge for net pens out in the ocean. Super chill that salmon suffer from in January and February and March is a huge concern as well. So I, for one, can't imagine, given the extremes of warm and cold water, I can't imagine having net pens in the ocean one day longer.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to try an online question. Can you hear this? Yes, there's a question online asking, what do you think might be the impact of the open pen industry? What do you think is the impact of the open pen industry in sponsoring specific research projects at the houses? Do you think there's any implication in that?
I wouldn't. Yes, the question is, does research work that's been established at Dalhousie related to finfish aquaculture, what do I think of that, or what are the impacts of that? That's a delicate subject that I really don't want to discuss today, only in so much as I'm fiercely opposed to a too close a connection between academic research and corporate sponsorship. It can be done with the best of intentions to make sure that pure research is undertaken, but it's not easily done, I can assure you of that. Dalhousie, I met 3 different times with a former vice president of development, and I expressed to her my concerns about the close affiliation between not just a given company, but companies generally. Universities require funding, but it's a very slippery slope when universities are funding academic research.
Bob, I'm gonna try again. Can you speak to the fishing of stockfish like herring and anchovies, which are needed to make fish meal to feed those feedlots? What do you think that implies for the food security of coastal communities?
Okay, the question is, various fisheries that are required to produce the feed meal for open net pen, what do I think the impact of that will be? Some of the species that are used may be purchased locally, but I think far more are purchased globally. If someone wants to watch a very compelling analysis of the topic, watch Salmon Wars. It's a hour-long documentary made by Silver Donald Cameron, well known to many in this community, highly respected, recipient of the Order of Canada. He had a documentary in which the requirement to produce much more feed than will be grown in the ultimate product is revealed very, very carefully. Now, things have changed. Jeff will tell me that feed is changing over the years, but it's an ongoing problem of the conversion from food into the ultimate product. So, and also, if somebody wants to read what I consider the definitive book on this subject, it's also known as Salmon Wars, by Catherine Collins and Douglas Franz, highly, highly respected journalists who wrote Salmon Wars, the book, as compared with Salmon Wars, the documentary. Fascinating, revealing reading, which tells you many of the inside story of the industry. You do.
Yes, this question comes to us from online. Has the consolidation of the lobster fishery through companies like Clearwater hurt the lobster industry as a whole? And secondly, has Clearwater, have they not raised this issue of damage from open net pen fish farming and used their power, contact, and money to insist on regulatory change? And thirdly, what have Sobeys and Loblaws and independents with their influence done to end the buying of open net pen fish farms and to pressure the government?
I'm not sure I can answer all 3 of those questions. In terms of Clearwater, John Risley, former chair of Clearwater, wrote a very compelling opinion piece 2.5, 3 years ago, it may be now, in which he said that the aquaculture sector, finfish aquaculture in the ocean, had to essentially take a close look at itself, that it was supporting a model that was, in his view, unsustainable and would come back to haunt them. In terms of Sobeys and Loblaws and others, many of them are now carrying on a regular basis on land closed containment salmon. not as frequently as we might like, not as well advertised and distinguished as we might like, but there's a growing awareness in the supermarket sector that they've got to do better and got to offer consumers more choices. And the historical model is not well received by many of their customers.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Well, here. Just a brief comment, actually. You haven't mentioned the effect of escaped farm salmon on the wild population.
Yes.
At one time, we used to have genetically distinct salmon populations popped up the different rivers. Just recently, I saw what I thought was a hilarious comment by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, that they're now trying to breed different strains of salmon to try and get back to what used to be.
Yes. No, I did not talk about that, and shame on me. The challenge of escapes, commonly called escapes, and the subsequent interbreeding of those escapes with real wild Atlantic salmon has been always considered a threat to the industry. The Atlantic Salmon Federation has been very vocal in this regard. It's a serious threat, and escapes from net pens, particularly now that we have climate change issues. I keep thinking of what it must have been like on some of these major storms we've had in the last 5 years to be a salmon out in a net pen somewhere in Nova Scotia. So yes, it's a big issue. The diminution of the original wild salmon is an ongoing concern. It's a reality.
And that's been happening in BC because for their net pens, they've been using Atlantic salmon,
Yes,
which have now been interbreeding with the native salmon.
yes, yes.
So
No,
I think that's why, I think you mentioned there was more concern about pens on MBC.
yes, the government of Canada has shut down or announced that there would be a shutdown of open net pens in the province of British Columbia, bearing in mind that this is a jurisdictional issue. The federal government have jurisdiction over this field in Western Canada, and the provincial governments in Atlantic Canada have jurisdiction here in Atlantic Canada. I'm not aware of any other field of activity where there's a comparable division of jurisdiction, but such is life, and it makes it more difficult.
Really looking at the time, we have two more questions. We have one here and then a gentleman there who would like to say something. And one last one online. Okay, so please go ahead. And Stewart, do repeat the question. When you
Okay.
I'm all in favor of the lobster fishery. I have 2 members of my family who are lobster fishermen. I buy fish every week from the Seaport market. I rotate through species, but I bought both wild open pen salmon, and I bought closed contained inland salmon. That's how I would describe them. Here's my problem. It's taste. There is no comparison to me between the contained salmon and the wild salmon. So there's a problem. But I don't know how, not only is there a price differential, but there's a taste differential. So it'll be interesting to see whether the closed contained salmon farmers can improve their product to the point where it's equally delicious.
I try in lobster and in salmon and in anything else not to delve into taste issues because they are so subjective. I've heard people tell me that they much prefer open net pen salmon taste. I've had people tell me they much prefer on land closed containment taste. Taste is so subjective on any of these issues that it's really an area where I'm not comfortable, but I recognize your point.
Mr. Lamont. Folks, my name is Jeff Bishop. I'm the Executive Director of the Aquaculture Association of Nova Scotia. Stewart, thank you very much for your talk this afternoon. As always, I'm more than open-minded when listening to people talk about various issues and sectors that I'm involved with. But what I have a really hard time with is when people make generalities and make them sound like fact. You spoke about how dare someone call themselves a farmer and related that to the use of pesticides. I'd suggest you go nowhere near an agriculture sector meeting in this province if they ever use pesticides. That's again up to the particular farmer. And I'm not equating it to the use of it in aquaculture, but that's the type of opinionated pieces that you're trying to sell as fact, Mr. Lamont, that is not factual.
May I respond?
No, you refer to, I just have a few more points before I'd like to. You refer to, that we should be focusing on land-based aquaculture. I think it's a great opportunity, what's out there, but it is not the answer yet. And I think you'll find that even right here in our own backyard, that those facilities have failed. The ones that have been, very few of them have found the magic market to go forward. I encourage them to be more than anything. I love to see the success of that, but to stand there and claim that it is solely based on one aspect of aquaculture, and that's the reason why you see it as the way forward, is very troubling to me. You talk about Norway as the example. Norway, every sound and bay that they can grow fish in are doing it in marine-based aquaculture systems. And now they've started to use on land-based as well, because they see the benefit of having both, because they haven't got the space that's left to do in the marine-based system at a sustainable level. Less than 1% of the coastline of this province has aquaculture, not just kingfish, aquaculture operations total. We're talking about, sorry, I said less than 3% of what we have in the province is aquaculture operations. That's shellfish, finfish, marine plant operations. Making it sound like it's in every bay and every inlet in this province is an over-exaggeration that allows folks that aren't as familiar with the aquaculture sector to think something's quite different. And that, Mr. Lamont, is the type of rhetoric that I have a huge problem with when someone stands forward and talks about the realities of what's happening within our province when it's nothing more than your opinion.
You've only raised 5 issues. I'm not sure I can cover them all. What I'll say is this. What a wonderful thing, this discussion, my presentation, the questions, the response of the audience. What a wonderful thing that it's on tape, because we will be able to see what I said and what I didn't say. You're saying I'm misrepresenting things. I'm suggesting you're misrepresenting me. I didn't relate my concerns about the nomenclature of farming to pesticides. I related it to the activity that you're engaged with right from the get-go, that it's a feedlot mechanism that is polluting our coastal waters. That's why I can't accept that it's farming. So let's all review the tapes when the time comes, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, Stewart, very, very much for a very insightful report.